So, without further ado, please allow me to welcome Andy.
Right, thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. Quick introduction, yeah, as Simon said, my name's Andy Farrell. I founded Management and Safety Training about 12 years ago now. I am, amongst other things, I'm a fellow IIRSM and other things. Main interest I've got is things like accident investigation, decision making, system resilience, and so on. And one of the things that runs through that is blame. That's the topic I've got for today. Is blaming people. Is it really that simple? We'll go through a lot of topics doing this, a lot of subjects that could be talked about as we go through. Any questions, as Simon said, please drop them in the chat box. We'll pick them up at the end of the session. Quite happy to do that. And let's see how we get on. So, blame, is it really that simple? It's all about the people. And what we need to keep in mind from the very beginning is that people generally don't come to work to cause trouble, get things wrong, make problems for people. Okay, in real life, you might get the odd awkward one, but normally people come to work with the idea of getting things right if they can. They're asked to do a job and they'll have a go. The problem is that people are human. And because they're human, they're going to make errors. And realistically, there's nothing we can do about it. We can minimize the chances, and that's something I'm interested in, is how you can reduce the chance of errors happening. But realistically, errors will occur occasionally. And it's a matter of then what you do about it and how you handle it. That's the key thing. We talk about blame. What do we mean by the term blame? Well, for our purposes, I think a reasonable definition is that the person not only has responsibility for the error, but also they'd acted negligently during the process. So there are two components to blame. There's responsibility for it and also negligence. How were they thinking at the time? Negligence, I'm sure you're all aware, the person behaves in a way which falls short of the standard which you could reasonably expect of that person, given those specific circumstances. So this is a fairly common term in safety management, negligence. So we got to look at the context. Bear in mind, we sometimes come across the phrase gross negligence. The difference between negligence and gross negligence is that gross negligence means the standard fell far short, way below what you'd expect. But a person doesn't quite come up to the mark, that can be down to negligence. So what we need to think about before we start thinking about blaming somebody, we've got to decide, is it appropriate? And to do that, we have to ask, what was going on at the time? Why did they behave in the way that they did? So let's take an accident. Okay, now this is not unusual, surprisingly. It's fairly regular occurrence that lorries will hit bridges. A number of reasons why they do it. But let's look at this one. So we've got a lorry which is stuck under a bridge. If you notice, on the left-hand side, you've got the warning triangle giving the height of the bridge. Now, I don't think it's 3 foot 6 inches. I think it's more likely 13 foot or 23 foot, but it's the way the picture's being cropped. But certainly there is a warning to the driver that there is a limit on the bridge, and the driver should know what that limit is. Either he knows already or there's a plate in the cab to warn him, whatever, but he should be aware of the height restrictions on his vehicle. But he's got it stuck. So let's think about the blame side of it. Look at responsibility. Well, you can argue that in general, he's going to be responsible for this accident because he was behind the wheel. He was driving it. Now, that's not clear cut. You know, if you do accident investigation, what you have to do is have an open mind and don't assume anything. So the fact he's behind the wheel doesn't mean necessarily he's responsible. He probably was. But you've also got to take into account things like, was he taken ill at the wheel and therefore lost control? Or was there a mechanical failure? So for some reason, he couldn't stop the truck and he went under the bridge. You've got to eliminate all those. Well, let's assume, dangerous, but let's do it. Let's assume the driver was in control of the vehicle. So yes, he had responsibility. So does that mean you can blame him for what happened? You were driving it, you rammed under a bridge, it's your fault. Is it that simple? Well, I'd say no. It depends on the context. If you could demonstrate he'd been daydreaming at the wheel, then the answer is yes, because he was negligent. His behavior fell below the standard expected of a professional driver. If he was on the phone talking to somebody and not concentrating, you can argue that yes, he's negligent because he's not doing his job properly. But take another example. What about if he's new to that route for some reason? And so, to ensure he got the job done properly, he was using a sat-nav. And he was following the instructions the sat-nav gave him. And he wasn't aware that the data in the sat-nav was incorrect. The sat-nav had the wrong height for the bridge. Now, in that case, it might be appropriate, rather than just dishing out blame, but instead to give them advice about don't trust the sat-nav. They're not infallible. And you accept at the same time he wasn't being negligent. He was actually trying to do his job, and he got caught out by a faulty sat-nav. So it's a matter of context. Now, I've already pointed out the bridge had a height restriction, clearly shown. It wasn't masked or damaged or whatever. It wasn't covered in snow. Quite clear. So he didn't see it or didn't react to it. So surely that makes him negligent. Well, not necessarily. So I'm putting my consultant's hat on. Everything is not necessarily. It's not automatic that he was negligent because he ignored the sign. And I say that because you have to understand a quirk in how the human mind works. Now, I'm not a psychologist, never professed to be, but I am interested in what people do and why they do it. And I'm aware that is a quirk in the mind. It's an unconscious behavior, which is known as selective attention. So let's look at that in a bit more detail, because that could explain what happened. We're going to go back to 1999, two very famous psychologists, Simon and Chabris, and the photo credit to them. They ran an experiment. They asked students to count the number of passes made by basketball players in a short video. Now, this is a clip from the video itself. And what you've got 3 players with black shirts, 3 with white shirts. Although it's not clear, they've actually got 2 basketballs, not just one, and they're all milling around. So there's an awful lot going on. And the students were given a specific task. They were asked to count only the passes made by people wearing white shirts. It didn't matter who they passed to, but passes made by those with the black shirts did not count. They had to keep a running score of those passing just with white shirts. But remember, 6 people milling around, 2 balls flying around in a small space. A lot going on. The video ran for something like 35 seconds, 40 seconds, something of that nature. It wasn't a long one. So then they stopped it. And then the tutor, his first question was, rather than how many did you count, his first question was, put your hand up if you saw the gorilla. And half the students put the hand up, on average, because they did this a number of times, on average, half put the hand up, and the other half was sitting there going, what? What gorilla? You know, the man's gone mad. So then they ran the video back and said, don't bother counting, just watch what happens. And you can see from the screenshot what happened. Halfway through the exercise, somebody in a gorilla suit, and I hope it was a person and not a real gorilla, walked out into the center of the group, stood there, looked around, waved at the camera, and walked off. Blindingly obvious. But half the students didn't notice. How do we explain that? And they were sober, honestly. The explanation is that they were focusing on a complicated task, and the gorilla's appearance was unexpected. So they didn't expect it, it didn't register. The brain has only got a limited amount of processing power. So if a task is very challenging, such as counting passes, or if you're trying to follow a new route on a sat-nav and you're concentrating on what the sat-nav's saying and matching that to what the surroundings look like, then that is challenging. There's a lot of brain power being used. So a lot of information may not be processed. The driver may well have seen the bridge height warning, but it won't have registered with him because he wasn't expecting to see it. It wasn't what he was thinking about. He was concentrating and trusting what the sat-nav told him. So in a case like that, I would argue that the driver was not to blame because he was not negligent. He was responsible, but he wasn't negligent. Responsibility and blame are not the same thing. So you can see now why management have got problems sometimes when it comes to allocating blame. It's difficult. How do you decide? They did the wrong thing, but what about the actions? Are they negligent or not? You've got to think, what were they doing? What were they thinking? And why were they thinking whatever it was that they were thinking? Remember as well, because this is a serious matter, that if you get it wrong, then you could be doing an innocent person a serious injustice, especially if it's a serious matter, a major incident. You know, you don't allocate blame unless you have to. So the key questions, what were they doing and why, what were they thinking? You've got to examine the evidence, and that's what you do in accident investigation. You look at the evidence. We can call this, if you like, hindsight analysis. Now, it may be an obvious approach to find out what happened, but it's not as simple as it seems. Because the difficulty is that you already know what happened. And that can skew your interpretation of what you think about the incident. You can fall into the trap of, well, it was obvious that was going to go wrong. Well, clearly that was never going to work. Yeah, it's clear to you because you know it didn't actually work. But was it clear to them? That's the key question. Did they understand? Did they realize? What you have to do is start with an open mind, which is very, very difficult to achieve. Easy to say, but difficult to achieve. And you've got to consider it purely from their position and based on what they knew at the time. Forget everything else. What could they see? What could they know? What were they told? And how did they react to that? So therefore, from their viewpoint, was that response reasonable or not? And if it was reasonable, then it would not be fair to blame them. You can ask yourself the crucial question. If you were in their position, knowing only what they knew at the time, would you have made the same choices? Maybe you would. So you've got to think about these things. It's not so obvious. But beware that trap. It was obvious that was going to go wrong. It was clear it would never work. Anybody could see that. Yes, they could once they know what happened. Give an example of where this came out, this hindsight bias got involved by accident, in actual fact. There's a very famous accident, a big film about it, it's a very good film, about Cactus Air Flight 1549, which took off from LaGuardia in New York, 2009, routine domestic flight, very experienced pilot, Captain Sullenberger. And they've been going about 30, 40 seconds, so they're only at a couple of thousand feet. Lovely clear day, and they flew into a flock of Canada geese. Canada geese are big birds, big and heavy, and there's a lot of them. They couldn't avoid it. It was too late. They didn't show on radar. No one knew they were there. They flew right through the flock, and they got birds jammed into both engines. And the engines were damaged, and they stopped. So there they were, at less than 3,000 feet, if I recall it, and they just turned from an airliner into a glider. Okay, they didn't fall out of the sky because they've got speed. They're going to glide, but they're going to keep slowly coming down. The question is, how long have you got before you hit the ground? Now, the standard procedure would be to radio distress call, turn and glide back to the airport. Captain Sullenberger didn't. He told the controller, in fact, it's on YouTube. You actually listen to the commentary of the air traffic controller when Captain Sullenberger said, "No, I'm going into the Hudson River." And he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But that's what he decided to do. Highly dangerous. It was a procedure they didn't practice, never been tried. A lot could have gone wrong. The aircraft could have sank as soon as it hit the water. It could have broken up. It could have cartwheeled. There was no guarantee to get away with it. But his view was that is a chance. If we go down in the ground, we've got no chance. So he made a rapid split-second decision to go and land on the Hudson River. And he got away with it. There were a couple of people injured, but nobody was killed. And that's a genuine photograph from the time showing the aircraft floating in the Hudson River in the middle of winter. It didn't sink, luckily. Although you can't see it there. The left-hand engine, the one on the right of the picture, was actually torn off on the impact. And they were all rescued. A couple of people with cuts and bruises. I think some people stayed in hospital overnight, but nobody received severe injuries. Nobody was killed. Okay. The problem was that he had not followed procedure. He'd done it his way. Now, there was a full investigation, as you would expect. And what they did, they took the data from the flight recorders on the aircraft, they fed them into a simulator, and they ran two different simulators, one from the airline and one from Airbus. So two different teams did this, using experienced instructors, and they flew the flight using the data they had. And worryingly for Captain Sullenberger, most of the time, they managed to get back to the airport. So, had he made the wrong decision? Actually, he hadn't, because he pointed out that the crew already knew what was going to happen. In the flight simulator, they knew that within about 30 seconds of takeoff, it's all going to go bang, and we've got to get to the airport. They knew that was going to happen. He did not. And he said, what you have to do is build in decision time. I had to think about the best approach. Did I turn and go back to LaGuardia? Did I keep on going across the river and try and head for Teterboro Airport, a local one with a length of runway would take him? Or did he ditch it, land it in the river? He had to work out all the options, and that took time. And they took his point. And when they ran the simulations again, but they held a 35-second delay from impact, so the crew just sat there for 35 seconds and did nothing, and then attempted to recover to the airport, they never made it. So it proved he was right. But it was a matter of hindsight bias. They brought it in unwittingly into these simulations, forgetting he had to think about it. They knew what was going to happen. He didn't. So it was interesting, but he'd made the right decision. In fact, he and his crew later on got a medal for that. Okay, so far we've looked at blame as being an element of human failure. Some person's got it wrong. They misunderstood. They pushed the wrong button. They drove under a bridge, whatever. But there are other views about blame and human error. And there's a very good book, a field guide to understand the human error, from a chap called Professor Sidney Dekker, who's, I think he's at Melbourne University. And he's a specialist in human behavior. And he looks at accidents, accident causation, and so on. And what he argues in his book is that human error is actually a symptom of deeper trouble within the overall management system. And that's interesting. So he's not saying that people never make mistakes, but what he's saying is that quite often it starts with something wrong within your systems, and then it spirals, get out of control. And that argument was reinforced in 2015 by another specialist, Professor Hollnagel, Scandinavian. He and his colleagues published an academic white paper, which was entitled From Safety 1 to Safety 2. Safety 1 being the old way of looking at safety management, Safety 2 being a more holistic approach. And what they did, they looked in detail at the challenges that complex processes pose for safety management. And one of the concepts they looked at was the fact that work as imagined is not necessarily the same as work as done. And these are the two phrases they used: work as imagined, work as done. So the theory doesn't always match the practice. I'm not saying they came up with the idea, they designed it, because really they didn't. This goes back quite some time. There's in fact a Prussian general, late 19th century, General von Moltke, who came up with a phrase that's often used. It roughly translates as no plan survives contact with the enemy. So you can plan in theory as much as you like, but when you try and do something, the odds are something's going to go wrong, and you've got to accommodate that. And that's what they were saying. You can imagine it, but it's not always what you're going to get. You've got to make adjustments. Hollnagel argued that because of complexity, some modern systems, we're talking about complex systems here, they're almost impossible to visualize at the planning stage. Now, if you want an example of that, think about the design of a Formula One racing car. Okay. There's a lot of money spent on doing that. We're talking millions. They have their own wind tunnels. They have teams of specialists in aerodynamics, mathematics, physics, engineering, and they work together closely to come up with a design. And it's run through computer simulations, left, right, and center. They plan it, they calculate, they build models, they run them in wind tunnels. They do everything they can to check that that design is right before they build a multi-million-pound car. Doesn't always work, as Mercedes proved a couple of years ago, because they got their brand new car, they took it out on the test track, and I think Hamilton's opinion, basically, when he brought it back from the test drive, was it's a pile of junk. The problem was, as it shot down the straight at speed, it started to porpoise. It was going up and down all the time, bouncing, and they had no idea why. And I think it took them about 6 months of constant research, development, modifications, trial and error, before eventually they solved the problem, whatever it was. So despite all the research, the project was so complex, there were things they couldn't think about and didn't think about. So you've got a complex system which may or may not work. And if it doesn't work, it's the employees who constantly need to adjust these processes to make them work. If they didn't, then nothing's going to happen. What happens to the employee who doesn't make these adjustments? They come in, I do a job, I do my job, I don't do anything else. Or they're not allowed to make adjustments. You've got a management system which says just do what you're told. Don't ask questions, don't start arguing, just do it. Very bureaucratic system. What happens then if there's a problem with the work as imagined? Well, as the photograph, and honestly, I didn't Photoshop this. I got this off the internet. Complex projects like a major building program, it may have unexpected characteristics. Somehow they put those supports right in the middle of a walkway because nobody adjusted it. It says a lot actually about the management of that project, how they could allow that to happen, how nobody sat there and think, hang on, this is never going to work. The bridge is in the wrong place. They didn't. They just built it as required. So if employees don't get involved and aren't encouraged to get involved, this is the sort of thing that you risk happening. Employees have got to get involved. Okay, we can't go into these ideas about system 1, system 2, and so in great detail. But the message is clear. Think about Formula 1, think about that bridge. If something goes wrong, it's not enough to examine the behavior of the employees. You can't look at that building project and blame the employee. He's doing what he's told. The plan says, put the bridge there, so he did. He's just following instructions. Management need to think about whether there's a flaw in the general working process, like nobody checked what was happening. And it might be embarrassing for managers to do this, but it's got to be done to find out what actually went wrong. If you don't, it's just going to get worse. Now, so far, we've looked at situations where the blame might not be appropriate. Okay. So you might think that I'm sort of acting as an apologist for employees, that they cannot be blamed for anything. It's not their fault. The system's faulty, they get the wrong instructions, they're being misled by the equipment, so on and so forth. And yet these can be situations which might arise. So is blame just not appropriate? Does it actually serve a useful purpose? Well, actually, the answer is yes, it does. Blame is necessary when used appropriately. Because if you never assign blame when something goes wrong, then the implication you're giving is that you don't care. You don't care what happens. If something works, something doesn't work, if the building is useful or it's not, if the Formula 1 car goes in a straight line or it doesn't, who cares? That's the impression you give. And of course, that's got to be the wrong impression. So you've got to have a way of marking boundaries. And that's what blame does. People know that if you get something wrong and you do it knowingly, negligently, then there are repercussions. I'll give an example of that actually, based on my own experience. Not to do with the workplace as such, but in a previous career, I was once a prison officer. I was stationed at Parkhurst, so I can say I've been to Parkhurst, but I had a key. I can get out in the evening. I remember talking to one convict there, one prisoner, who'd spent the bulk of his life in jail for various things. You mentioned a jail, then Brummie, as we called him. He'd been there. He knew what it was like. And he spoke, surprisingly, he had a lot of regard for Manchester Nick. Strangeways, as they called it at the time. Because his view was, it's what he would term a screws nick, an officer's nick. He said it's harsh. The discipline is strong. He said, but you know where you stand. If you do this, it's fine. If you do that, you're in trouble. And you know that from the very beginning. There's no if, buts, or maybes. It's all very clear. So that's what was happening. There were positive boundaries there set up by discipline. That's what acceptable behavior. That is not acceptable behavior, and it will receive censure. And they knew that, and they could work with it. It made life for them more comfortable in a way, because they knew exactly where they stood. So marking the boundaries is important. People understand what is and is not required of them. But blame can be damaging to people. It can damage careers, livelihoods. People can lose their jobs. So blame has got to be assigned appropriately, and the sanctions should be reasonable, and they should be proportionate. So what do you mean by appropriately? Well, it should be done without fear or favor. You can visualize a system where, let's say, a sales team, and you've got somebody who's a top flight salesperson, always top of the list, massive number of sales, greatest sales revenue, blah, blah, blah. They are the star performer. And that might go to their head. They might start taking shortcuts or not doing things or ignoring some paperwork, whatever, which is not allowed. But because it's them, nothing happens. But somebody else does it and they get bounced. You haven't returned your forms, you'll be spoken to. He doesn't return the forms. Well, he's all right. Fred's a good lad. He knows what he's doing. And that's unfair. You've got to have fairness across the system. So the blame has got to be assigned appropriately. The sanctions should be reasonable. So you match them to the extent of the offence. If it's a minor offence, it's a minor sanction. Major offence, major sanction, like maybe written warnings, final written warnings, whatever. But it's got to be reasonable and applied across the board. And it's got to be proportionate. Now, what I mean is you don't punish the whole team because one person got something wrong, no matter what happened. You know, you can't do that. It's not a matter of you shoot one to encourage the others. You've got to treat each person individually, and it's got to be a proportionate response to what's going on. So again, it calls for good management judgment. Am I acting appropriately? Is it reasonable? Is it proportionate? Is in fact it justified? Is blame required anyway? The other thing about blame, which you need to think about a little bit, it's not obvious, it should also have a purpose. You don't just bounce somebody because they got it wrong. What you want to happen, ideally, is the offender reflects on and then improves their behavior. Now, we're talking real world. That's not always going to happen. If somebody is basically bone idle, then giving them a telling off is probably not going to change the fact that they are bone idle. But if somebody has been pushing their luck, but generally means well, a sudden short, sharp shock might be effective and might put them back, as it were, on the path of righteousness. So that's what you're going to think about. Can you try and get some benefit for them out of the punishment so they don't do it again, and they don't do it because they don't want to do it? It's simple as that. They realize that they were in the wrong. It's not always going to work, but it's not a bad idea to have in the back of your mind. Can we try and encourage this person to stop offending, to get it right next time round? One point I want to touch on, again, it's a big subject, but in some organizations, you have this idea of a no blame culture, which sounds wonderful. Whatever you can do, it doesn't matter, you don't get blamed. It doesn't work that way. It's used in high risk areas such as aviation, traffic control, maybe in process industries, where if you make a mistake, then the consequences can be disastrous. If a pilot, for example, misinterprets which runway he's going to, or inadvertently crosses over a stoplight onto an active runway without realizing it, then these are serious matters. They're going to be dealt with. But what you're trying to do is to get the person to admit the fault before anything happens. So if a pilot, for example, has realized that he almost overshot a stop bar onto an active runway, which is what happened recently in Japan, when an aircraft crossed a stop bar and was hit by a landing jet. If the pilot realizes he almost did that and he admits it, then something can be done about it to find out why. Was there something wrong with the lighting system? It's not clear. Where the instructions not clear. You can find out what went wrong. But you need to be able to give them a guarantee that if they are honest and admit the mistake, they're not going to get penalized for it. Because if you hide that mistake, the next time they may cross the stop bar and you've got a fatal accident. So it works because you find out what's gone wrong before it really goes wrong and really causes problems. But to do this, you need to have trust. And that's not easy to build. Trust between the staff and the employer. So the staff know if they do admit an honest mistake, they're not going to end up being fired or disciplined, demoted, whatever. Then, yeah, they'll be given some guidance as to how to avoid the mistake next time round, but they'll also get the appreciation. They've had the courage and the honesty to come forward, and then management can deal with it and try and make the necessary improvements. So staff are trusting the employer not to come down on them like a ton of bricks. But there's also trust between the employer and the staff. Because what you do not want is for people for not taking responsibility for their actions. You do not want people to think that this is some kind of get out of jail card, that we can do what we want and the management will just be very understanding and we just carry on as normal. No, if somebody is being deliberately careless, deliberately negligent because they can't be bothered, because, hey, nothing ever happens anyway, then that person has got to be jumped on from a great height, basically, to use the management term. Because if it's allowed to happen, it destroys the whole system. Management, again, they're laying down boundaries. We have trust in you, you have trust in us. If you betray that trust in you, there will be serious penalties because we cannot allow that to happen. It'll destroy the whole no blame system, and we need this system. So people have got to take responsibilities and behave properly. But if you've got that trust, you can actually use mistakes, errors, whatever, to build the system and improve things. It's not easy, but it is sometimes important to have that. Won't work in all situations, but high risk, it is likely to work. So what have we looked at? I've gone through this very, very quickly, and I realize that. But the point I'm trying to make is that blame is a concept which seems very easy, but it's actually difficult to understand sometimes. There are nuances to blame, which if you're going to do the management job effectively, you've got to be aware of. You've got to think about it. You've got to accept the people come to work to do a reasonable job. They don't want to make mistakes. They don't intend to make mistakes, but they're human and therefore they're fallible. They can get things wrong. They can misunderstand. They can forget. There's a whole area of why and how people actually make mistakes, and there's errors, there's violations, there's all sorts of things. But yeah, people can get things wrong. Excuse me. So you've got to accept that. And then when something does go wrong, it will occasionally, no matter what you do, you've got to look at things from their point of view. Remember the need to have the open mind. Don't, for heaven's sake, fall into the trap of, well, that was obvious, wasn't it? That was never going to work. You know that because of hindsight. You know it didn't work because you've seen the results. But what did they know or believe at the time? Did they genuinely think that what they were doing was correct or appropriate? Had they been given the right information? Had they been given the right tools, the right resources? Crucially, the right amount of time to do the job. You know, how many times do you get things going wrong in industry because things are in a hurry? You haven't got time for all that. Just get the job done, blah, blah, blah. And then things go wrong. You can't blame them for that. They're doing what they can. But what was their point of view? What did they have to work with? What did they think that they were doing? Were they negligent or just trying to do their job? Remember, people have to adjust the system all the time. If they didn't, most systems would grind to a halt. So they make adjustments. Sometimes they make the wrong ones. You need to understand why. And finally, remember the fault may lie with the process and not with the person. Are you asking them to maybe do the impossible? Are you giving them the time and the resources, the training, the knowledge they need to do this job properly? Or are you simply taking shortcuts? Are you making assumptions? Well, it's obvious what you do with this, you know. When you can imagine a situation where you give an apprentice the keys to a bulldozer, well, it's obvious how you drive a bulldozer. Any fool can do it, you know, and then wonder why he's driven to the side of the building. You've got to think ahead. Make sure the process you're working to is appropriate and, in fact, it's got some resilience, allows for things going wrong. So it's got some flexibility in it. So there we go. I've pulled up a little bit short because I think there may well be questions, and that's fine. So I'll have time for that. I hope you found it interesting. So it is just an overview of a very complicated subject, but a fascinating one. People are fascinating. And obviously, if you think I can be of any further help, then you've got my details there, email or mobile phone, whatever, or through IRSM. I'm sure they'll pass your message across. But apart from that, thank you for putting up with me. And any questions, then we'll try and deal with them the best we can. But thank you very much. And back to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Andy. Very, very interesting. And yeah, there was so many things you said there that I can relate to. And yeah, being a junior manager many years ago, and I was always looking to blame somebody. And now I have those conversations with my own management team that when they've got an issue over something that's happened, my first question to them is generally along the lines of, well, how did you ask them to do it? And let's just take a look at the process. Risk assessments, when people do risk assessments, there was probably not more than a year ago where there was where you talk about the work imagined as work done, and the guys that are actually doing the job on the process, and varies so differently to the risk assessment. And then you say, well, why are you doing it like this? We'll say, well, this is how it should be done. And right, it is. And I think anybody that's in a leadership position or a management position, you or wanting to just to understand the process or how something could have gone wrong, to actually get down onto to the front line, if you like, down in the trenches with the guys that are doing this, and just to see it firsthand, it's worth its weight in gold, really. And you mentioned Sidney Dekker in his book, the Field Guide to Understand Human Error. That is a really good book, and if anybody's not read it, If this is of interest to you, then I would thoroughly recommend a read of that, because it goes into what you discuss in some more detail. Just looking at the chat, I don't think there is any questions. I can't see any. There's none on the chat here at all. I think a question from me, Andy, would be if it was the one thing that we could all do to improve our understanding of our human behavior and how that relates to the things that go wrong. What would your recommendation be?
I think managers have got to sort of learn to stand back a little. Don't make the mistake of just jumping when you think you know what's going on. Oops, come in. That could be a phone call.
That's mine.
You know, you face a situation, you've got to think, rather than just react to it, step back a moment and try and look at it in the whole and think, well, what really happened here and why? If you think somebody's wrong, well, you know, you've got the two questions: were they responsible and were they negligent? And to decide the negligence, what were they thinking? What did they know at the time? What were they trying to achieve? You've got to take those into account rather than simply, what the hell have you done? You know, you're fired. You know, that's jumping the gun a little bit. It can happen if you get angry. So you had a project on the go and somebody's got it wrong and wrecked the project, or an expensive piece of equipment and they've reduced it to rubble. You know, you're going to be annoyed. But you've got to get away from the emotions and think, what actually happened here? You know, always think before you scream, I think, is the answer.
Okay, no, that's good. We have one question come in. There's quite a long one here, so I'll read it to you, Andy. It says, poacher turned gamekeeper here, so I believe the same. People are the solution, not the problem. In current investigations, finding it difficult to get senior management to buy into root cause as an organizational issue, some / most times, but it's easier to blame an individual. It's a hard sell if an organization admits they needed to change due to an accident, then they are open to claim. Question is how to persuade that name, blame and shame only breeds contempt and mistrust from the workforce. If this is addressed in the remainder of the webinar, please disregard.
It's a difficult one, because you're trying to get management to change their attitudes, and the problem which you've got is that there can be a lot of investment in these processes. If senior management have got their careers based on a certain process being adopted or a certain piece of equipment being used, they're going to be very reluctant to change their views. And it may possibly be a case of economics, you know. If we keep on blaming people and firing people, you'll end up never being able to recruit anybody. Is this really what you want? If we don't get to the root cause, if we don't get to the, rather than shoot the person involved, we don't get to the reason behind the accident, it's going to keep happening. What's that going to do to your insurance premiums? You know, there are arguments you can use. It's not easy, I grant you. And you've got to batter away at it. But sometimes economics can work. And it's things like insurance premiums are going to go up, your retention rates are going to go down, and recruitment's expensive. So long term,